Let's start today's session. Chapter 6 of the Ashtavakra Mahageeta. O pure consciousness that you are, do not concern yourself with the concepts of affirmations and negations. Abide in the silence of the eternal bliss that you are and live happily. Give up conceptualizing altogether. Have no beliefs or concepts of any kind. You are the ever-free consciousness. How can any thinking help you in any way? What a tremendous impassioned plea Ashtavakra makes to the illusionary individual Janak. Actually, the sage is fully aware that his dialogue is in fact between the universal impersonal consciousness and the identified personal consciousness, part of the process and phenomenal duration of the spiritual evolution. Nonetheless, he plays the role of the teacher to perfection. He knows that this is Leela, the functioning of the totality of manifestation, the dream play that is scripted by consciousness, produced and directed by consciousness, with every character therein being played by the consciousness itself. This is precisely what the sage has in mind when he says, whatever you perceive in your own reflection is your own reflection. The observer is the observed. Then who is the perceiver? Consciousness is the perceiver. The body is merely mechanism through which the perceiving takes place. In the absence of consciousness, the body, which is merely a collection of materials, cannot do any perceiving. The individual perceiver, as the ego, considers itself as much of an object as the perceived. Both are object expressions of subjective consciousness. It is in this perspective that the sage tells the disciple that whatever he perceives is your own reflection. Both are objects, and the true perceiver is the consciousness. Strictly speaking, there is neither the perceiver nor the perceived. There is only perceiving as the subjective functioning. The observer object and the observed object are merely the two ends of the process of perceiving. This aspect of the teaching of Advaita, that the observer is the observed, that all objects in the totality of manifestation are the expressions of the one subjective reality, is the very basis of the teaching, and the most difficult for the mind intellect to accept. This aspect of the teaching of Advaita, that the observer is the observed, that all the objects in totality of manifestation are expressions of one subjective reality, is the only basis of the teaching and most difficult for any mind intellect to accept. It has been my experience that the illustration which follows has been effective in many cases. Suppose you were to have 10 photographs taken in 10 different costumes, each with an appropriate facial makeup. The uninformed observer will naturally believe that they are photos of 10 different persons. But you know that in all of them the real person is only yourself. All that has happened in this living world is that consciousness has created the billions and billions of objects of its own representations, which constitute the totality of manifestation, like in the pictures or the photographs. Consciousness has infused some of these objects animals and human beings with an aspect of itself called sentience. This gives them a sense of individual presence, whereby they consider themselves as separate individuals, as entities separate from the others. In reality, all are three-dimensional representations of itself in different shapes and sizes, each with different inherent characteristics in infinite variety. In the lovely poetic image, sage Gyaneshwar says that it is the Shakti, consciousness in movement, or activated primal energy, who gave Shiva his very existence and status. The form and name, Nam Roop, through the manifestation of the universe. It was as if Shakti felt ashamed that her husband, in spite of all his awesome potentiality, should be formless and nameless, and so decided that he needed augmentation. He also points out that the manifestation, the appearance, like the reflection of an object in the mirror, provides proof not of the existence of two objects but only of the original object. Unicity provides the illusion of duality in order to prove its own existence. Yes, the unicity provides the illusion of duality in order to prove its own existence. There is another aspect to this matter of the perceived being your own reflection. It's a practical aspect seen in everyday life. Take the case of the confirmed grouch who, on being greeted good morning on a lovely day, responds by asking, good, how about you? What you see depends upon your mood, and that your moods are themselves a reflection of a deeper understanding. Someone who has been conditioned to be unusually cautious and suspicious will naturally regard everyone he meets as an enemy. What he perceives will be tinted by his conditioning. When such conditioning exists, it will be not only futile but actually frustrating to be asked to love thy neighbor. Love for the neighbor can arise only when there is an understanding deep enough to penetrate the earlier conditioning. The understanding is that all human beings are creations of the same consciousness, objective expressions of the same subjective reality. Each is conceived and created with certain given characteristics, so that consciousness in its functioning as totality can bring about actions based on these given characteristics through the concerned organisms. Such an understanding means an acceptance of the fact that all human beings are merely instruments through which totality functions. In other words, when the me as a separate entity disappears, how can the others remain? Whether there is 1 zero or a billion zeros, what exists is only a zero, unless behind those zeros there is a 1 or more. Such an understanding means accepting the fact that all actions which take place through any body, mind, organism are not the acts of any individual entity. Therefore, an insult, for instance, will have no relevance in the absence of me. What is considered normal in everyday life is separation. What is not realized is that in such normality exists conflicts and unhappiness. So the sage says that unless this separation of me and mine from the not me and not mine is given up, there can be no happiness. And yes, this giving up of a separation is considered impractical and abnormal. This is where the misconception lies. The human being wants to retain his separation, and yet he demands happiness, which is the essential character of the whole consciousness. Indeed, this is the basic problem of the seeker. He intuitively feels the oneness of the universe and is deeply aware of the universal pulse of unity. Yet he wishes to experience the happiness of the universal beingness of nominality as the separateness of his individual entity in phenomenality. He does not realize that the impersonal sense of presence, the impersonal universal consciousness, is a normal state and not, as he mistakenly assumes, an aberration or altered state of consciousness. It is separation which is an aberration and therefore causes conflict and unhappiness. And then Ashtavakra says, give up all distinctions such as I am this, I am that, I am not this, I am not that. The ordinary word in Sanskrit for giving up is tyaga, but the sage uses the word santyaga. There is a great deal of difference between the two. Tyag means more in the nature of an order or an instruction, whereas santyaga implies a sense of faith and conviction, a sense of totality and permanence. In the other verses in the series, the sage tries to impress upon the disciple the intellectual reasons which could help to bring about the transformation from the intellectual understanding to an intuitive conviction. The distinction between the two words is a kind of distinction between the futile personal efforts of an addict to give up his addiction and the sudden divine urge which impels the giving up of the addiction. The separation between the me and the not me is a sort of addiction, which needs outside help, and the Guru is the means through which such outside help becomes available at the appropriate time. There's another more subtle aspect of this matter of giving up or letting go. There's one kind of giving up which has as its basis the giving up of one thing in order to get another, something later. But there's more genuine giving up where something is given up as being harmful or useless by itself, not necessarily in exchange for something more acceptable. It's a question of giving up a concept or an illusion out of conviction about its illusories without any other motive. What the sage is saying is not that giving up the separation between me and the other will bring about happiness, but simply that when this illusory separation is lost, what remains is happiness. In other words, the original state of oneness is happiness, and that separation is a sort of eclipse on that state. With the end of separation, the original state of happiness prevails in its pristine state, and it's not a question of giving up a smaller house in order to get a bigger house. That's what he exactly means. The sage then proceeds to explain that it is through ignorance that the universe appears to exist, and that other than consciousness, nothing exists. Ignorance means separation. Separation means considering oneself as an independent entity, separate from the rest of the world. The obvious question at this stage would be, how did this basic separation arise? The answer is simple. The first split arose because of the split between the observer and the observed, the subject and the object. This split is actually the mechanism necessary for the subjective functioning of observing or perceiving. This is a simple fact. If this is truly understood in its full intensity, the only possible reaction would be for the eyes to close and the mind to become vacant. Then Ashtavakra proceeds to explain that it is through ignorance that the universe appears to exist, and that other than consciousness, nothing exists. Ignorance means separation. Separation means considering oneself as an independent entity, separate from the rest of the world. The obvious question at this stage would be, how did the basic separation arise? The answer is simple. The first split arose because of the split between the observer and the observed, the subject and the object. The split is actually the mechanism necessary for the subjective functioning of observing or perceiving. That's a simple fact. If this is truly understood in its full intensity, the only possible reaction would be for the eyes to close and the mind to become vacant, at least for a few moments, until the observer, the me, the mind, arises again as the observer separated from which is observed. When the time and the place are appropriate, this understanding becomes so deeply ingrained that the individual suddenly disappears as a separate observer, and everything is not observed but witnessed. Observing by an individual observer inevitably involves the reaction of comparing and judging what is observed. Impersonal witnessing means nominal observing of the phenomenal functioning without any comparing and judging. No distinction is made between the acceptable and the unacceptable, between the consequential host of other opposites, which are really interconnected but are not understood by the concerned individual as such. Such witnessing is possible only when there is disidentification from the functioning of phenomenality. The significance of phenomenal manifestation and its functioning as being merely a kind of dream play, an illusory appearance on the screen of consciousness, is truly understood. And such understanding is not comprehension by an individual comprehender, but apperception, a dimension totally unrelated to individual comprehension. This is what the sage means when he tells the disciple, when the mind is free from the pairs of opposite, like this is done, but that is not yet done. It requires an indifference alike to righteousness, wealth, desire for sensual pleasure, as well as liberation. One who has an aversion for sense objects is considered a renunciate. The one who covets them is considered sensual. But the one who neither rejects nor covets is unconcerned with them, is called the observer or the witness. This set of verses will shock the traditional seeker who has been conditioned to believe that nothing can be acquired without hard work and personal effort. And this is indeed so in everyday life. Here he is told that he must forget, wherever he has learned, that there is no qualitative difference between work, pleasure, and meditation. True happiness consists not in volitional effort to achieve happiness, but only understanding what self-abidance is. And self-abidance is not something to be acquired, but something which arises spontaneously when the mind is free of the concepts of right and wrong, the acceptable and the unacceptable, and all such pairs of opposites. The sage tells us that the enlightenment or self-abidance is our natural self. It does not need to be acquired. Any personal volition effort means only strengthening the ego, the me. It is itself the obstruction which covers and hides our original state. What is more, the sage assures us that the true understanding of this very fact is all that is necessary for the seeker. And when the understanding is true and deep, the question, I have understood what you are saying, but having understood your theory, what do I actually do in everyday life, does not arise. It cannot arise. If it does arise, the understanding has not been either true or deep enough. Specifically, what is true understanding? What does it precisely mean? It would be difficult to give a more succinct answer than the statement of the Chinese sage Shenhui. Only by avoiding intentions will the mind be rid of objects. In other words, true understanding would be that there is no separate individual entity who can have intentions, and there is nobody who can have the choice of decision and action. The true understanding is that the apparent individual entity does not live but is being lived as an instrument through which consciousness functions. Such an understanding that the individual entity cannot be the subject of any objects must necessarily mean that no individual can be comprehender of any knowledge. When no individual exists, what remains is a perception, enlightenment, and understanding. True understanding comports the realization that it is only the me, notion, the ego, that can have any intention or volition or will. Indeed, they are all synonyms. True understanding will also comport the realization that in the absence of any individual comprehender, the true understanding cannot possibly be the result or consequence of effort by a non-existent doer. Unawareness of the ego is the awareness of the self. When the me is absent, it is the I, the universal impersonal I, which is present in everyday living. Ramana Maharishi, the great master idler, was once asked by a visitor why he did not come to do some social service or at least go out and preach his own teaching instead of merely lying about on his couch. The Maharishi calmly asked him, "How do you know that all that is necessary is not already happening just through my being here?" You become a master idler when all sense of personal doership is totally lost. Give up action, give up doing, and you become an idler. Give the sense of personal doership and let action happen, and you become the master idler. As Omar Khayyam has put it, after a momentary silence spake, some vessel of a more ungainly make. They sneer at me for leaning all awry. What did the hands then of the potter shake? Ashtavakra says, when the mind is free from pairs of opposites, this is done and that is not done, it acquires an indifference alike to righteousness, wealth, desire for sensual pleasure, as well as liberation. The sage brings out the important fact that once separation is seen as a mere concept, all conceptually separated opposites lose their validity. All that now remain is the impersonal sense of presence, without any naam, roop, individual name and form, that I am. Quote Omar Khayyam again. There was a door to which I found no key. There was the veil through which I might not see. Some little talk a while of me and thee. There was, and then no more of thee and me. In the absence of thee and me, in the absence of separation, lies true happiness. Desire is the root ignorance, and so long as desire persists, the sense of acceptable and unacceptable, which is the branch and sprout of the tree of samsara, must necessarily continue. The quote Ashtavakra says, activity begets attachment. Abstention from activity generates aversion. Rid of bondages of opposites. The wise man established in the self lives like a child. One who is attached to samsara wants to renounce it in order to free himself from misery. But the one who is not attached continues to remain in the samsara and yet live happily. He who seeks enlightenment as an individual seeker and still is identified with the body is neither a jnani or a yogi and suffers misery. Unless everything is totally forgotten, you cannot be established in the self, even if Shiva, Vishnu or Brahma be your preceptor. In Thus Spake Zarathustra, the Friedrich Nietzsche gives the disciples the ultimate message. Whatever had to be said has been said. Whatever had to be understood has been understood. Now forget whatever has been said. Forget everything I have said except this last message. Beware of Zarathustra. Unless the individuality is totally lost, how can there be enlightenment? In the course of spiritual evolution, the seeker at the appropriate times realizes that which he had been regarding as knowledge is really nothing but ignorance. He then strips off these clothes of conceptual knowledge, goes naked to the self-realized Guru, who clothes him in garments of true understanding. It is only then that the urge fulfills itself and the process, the impersonal process of the disidentification of the identified consciousness is completed. I finished my chapter 6 reciting for you guys. See you with chapter 7.